They came without warning, thousands of reptilian warriors swarming over the trenches, hissing and snarling, hungry for human blood. Private Zachary Thompson gripped his rifle tight, heart pounding, adrenaline surging. Around him, the soldiers of the 51st Colonial Infantry dug in, eyes wide with fear, watching the approaching horde. Humanity clung to a tenuous foothold on Kepler 186F, but now the ruthless Saurian Empire threatened to snuff out their last flickering hope. Plasma rounds lit up the dawn as battle erupted along the front line. Men screamed, bones shattered, flesh burned. The stench of death shrouded the battlefield. Zach fired until his rifle clicked empty, then fought hand to hand, grappling with scaly talons and gnashing fangs. A plasma bolt took his commanding officer's head clean off. Men fell back in disarray as the Saurians pressed their advantage. Zach found himself in charge of a ragged band of survivors, out of ammo and out of options. Sweat slicked his brow. His nerves stretched taut as piano wire. Then he remembered the whispers, rumors of a top-secret weapon, something called a nightmare engine. Desperation drove him to defy direct orders and crack open the sealed crate. Inside, an ominous device thrummed with power. Zach armed the machine. He felt it reach out and interface with his mind, uploading hideous visions, the very worst of the human psyche. All our savagery and brutality, our genocidal urges and unfettered cruelty. Zach shunted those nightmares into the alien hive mind. The Saurians shrieked in unison, clawing at their skulls. All semblance of discipline vanished as they drowned in a psychic tsunami of human depravity. They broke and ran, fleeing in all directions, trampling their own wounded in their haste to escape. Zach stood ankle-deep in shattered bodies and smoldering rubble. The nightmare engine weighed heavy in his hands and heavier still on his conscience. Humanity would survive this day, but Zach couldn't shake the feeling that they'd sacrificed more than just lives. The machine had won them victory, but it promised to exact a terrible and inevitable price. As the dust settled over the battlefield, an eerie silence descended. The surviving soldiers of the 51st Colonial Infantry stood in shocked disbelief, staring at the alien corpses littering the blood-soaked ground. Private Zachary Thompson emerged from the carnage, the nightmare engine still clutched in his trembling hands. His haunted eyes scanned the faces of his fellow soldiers, searching for some sign of understanding or absolution. Word of the stunning victory spread like wildfire through the human encampment. Soldiers cheered and clapped Zachary on the back, hailing him as a hero. Even the normally stoic Colonel John Hawkins cracked a rare smile as he pinned the sergeant's stripes onto Zachary's torn and stained uniform. "Damn fine work, Sergeant Thompson," Hawkins said gruffly. "You saved a lot of lives today. We won't forget that." But not everyone shared in the celebration. Major Simon Prescott, a severe-looking man in crisp fatigues, strode into the command tent, his face etched with disapproval. He fixed Zachary with a piercing glare. "Sergeant Thompson, do you have any idea what you've done?" Prescott demanded. "The nightmare engine was a classified project. You had no authorization to use it." Zachary met the major's accusing stare with a mix of defiance and weariness. "With all due respect, sir, we were out of options. It was either use the weapon or let the Saurians overrun us." Prescott's eyes sharp. "There will be consequences, Sergeant. Mark my words." As the major stormed out, Colonel Hawkins placed a reassuring hand on Zachary's shoulder. "Don't worry about Prescott. I'll handle him. You just focus on getting some rest." But rest would prove elusive for Zachary. That night, as he tossed and turned on his bunk, the memories of what he'd done assailed him. The nightmare engine had forced him to confront the darkest recesses of the human psyche, and now those twisted visions haunted his dreams. He saw himself committing unspeakable atrocities, reveling in the suffering of others. The line between nightmare and reality blurred until he jolted awake, drenched in cold sweat, his heart racing. Zachary wasn't the only one affected by the weapon's malign influence. Disturbing reports trickled in from across the regiment, soldiers babbling incoherently, lashing out at shadows, even turning on each other in fits of paranoid rage. The nightmare engine, it seemed, extracted a heavy toll from those who wielded it. Seeking answers, Zachary sought out Lieutenant Emily Chen, the regiment's resident xenopsychologist. He found her hunched over a makeshift workbench, studying schematics of the Nightmare engine. "Ah, Sergeant Thompson," Emily said, looking up from her work. "I was hoping to speak with you." "Lieutenant," Zachary said, taking a seat across from her, "I need to know more about this thing. What exactly did it do to the Saurians? To us?" Emily's expression turned grave. "The Nightmare engine is a weapon unlike any other. It taps into the darkest aspects of the human psyche and projects them outward, overwhelming the target's mind with visions of unimaginable horror." She leaned forward, her eyes intense. "But there's a price to pay for using such a weapon. It leaves a mark on those who wield it, a stain on the soul. I fear we may have unleashed something we cannot control." Zachary nodded grimly. He'd felt the weapon's insidious touch firsthand. "We need to be careful with this thing. Use it only as a last resort." "Agreed," Emily said, "but I'm afraid we may not have a choice." As if on cue, alarms blared throughout the compound. Colonel Hawkins' voice crackled over the intercom, ordering all personnel to battle stations. The Saurians had returned, their ships darkening the skies over Kepler 186F. The 51st Colonial Infantry scrambled to meet them, knowing that the fate of the planet, and perhaps all of humanity, hung in the balance. Zachary raced to join his squad, the Nightmare engine heavy in his hands. He knew the device offered their best hope of victory, but as he looked into the haunted eyes of his fellow soldiers, he couldn't shake the feeling that by using the weapon again, they risked losing more than just the battle. They risked losing themselves. The ground shook as the first Saurian drop pods slammed into the earth, disgorging hordes of reptilian warriors. Zachary steeled himself for the fight to come, knowing that the decisions he made in the next few hours would echo through eternity. The Nightmare engine had brought them this far. Now, as the darkness closed in, he could only pray it would be enough. The sky darkened as Saurian ships blotted out the sun. Zachary's grip tightened on the Nightmare engine, its weight a grim reminder of the choices that lay ahead. Colonel Hawkins's voice crackled over the comm, steel in his tone. "All units, prepare for deployment of the Nightmare engine. This is not a drill." Major Prescott burst into the command center, face flushed with anger. "Colonel, I must protest. We can't risk using that infernal device again. The psychological toll on our troops—" "Is noted, Major," Hawkins cut him off. "But it's our only chance. Sergeant Thompson, you're up." Zachary swallowed hard, fighting back the nausea that roiled in his gut. The memory of his last encounter with the engine clawed at the edges of his mind. But duty called, and he answered. "Yes, sir." The 51st Colonial Infantry fanned out around the Nightmare engine's mobile platform. Plasma fire lit up the sky as Saurian dropships disgorged their cargo. Through his scope, Zachary caught sight of a towering figure, Warlord Zath herself, leading the charge. "New breed of elites," Lieutenant Chen's voice crackled in his ear. "Psi shielded. Be careful." Zachary nodded, though Chen couldn't see him. He took a deep breath and activated the engine. Its psychic tendrils reached out, probing the minds of friend and foe alike. Zachary gritted his teeth as the horrors flooded in, humanity's darkest impulses given form. The effect on the Saurian forces was immediate. Entire squads dropped to their knees, clawing at their eyes and howling in anguish. But the CI-shielded elites pressed on, their scaled faces twisted in fierce dedication. "They're breaking through," someone shouted. The air filled with the stench of ozone and burning flesh as the two forces clashed. Zachary fired his rifle one-handed, the other still gripping the engine. A Saurian warrior lunged at him, mandibles snapping. He ducked, bringing his rifle butt up in a vicious strike that shattered the alien's jaw. A scream of pure rage cut through the din of battle. Zachary turned to see Private Donovan, eyes wild and unfocused, spraying fire indiscriminately into the ranks of his fellow soldiers. "Donovan, stand down!" Zachary shouted. But Donovan was beyond reason, lost in whatever nightmares the engine had dredged up from his subconscious. With a heavy heart, Zachary took aim and squeezed the trigger. Donovan crumpled, a look of relief spreading across his face in his final moments. "Thompson!" Colonel Hawkins bellowed. "We're losing ground. We need more power." Zachary cranked up the engine's output, feeling the psychic backlash like a migraine building behind his eyes. The Saurian advance faltered, but the CI-shielded elites kept coming. A commotion from the command tent drew Zachary's attention. Major Prescott grappled with Colonel Hawkins, trying to wrest control of the communications array. "This madness ends now," Prescott snarled. Hawkins drove his fist into Prescott's solar plexus. "Stand down, Major. That's an order." The two officers traded blows, their personal conflict a microcosm of the larger battle raging around them. "Lieutenant Chen," Zachary called out, "we need options." Emily's fingers flew across her datapad, brow furrowed in concentration. "I'm recalibrating the psychic matrix. If I can just—" Her words were cut off as a Saurian warrior vaulted onto the platform. Zachary whirled, bringing his rifle to bear, but he was too slow. The alien's claws raked across his chest, sending him sprawling. The nightmare engine clattered to the ground. Warlord Zath herself stepped onto the platform, her massive form dwarfing Zachary as he struggled to his feet. She hefted a crackling energy blade, mandibles clicking in anticipation. "Your mind weapon cannot save you now, human," she hissed. Zachary spat blood and raised his fists. "Then we'll do this the old-fashioned way." They clashed in a furious exchange of blows. Zachary's combat training allowed him to hold his own, but Zath's inhuman strength and reach gave her a clear advantage. Her energy blades sliced through the air, missing Zachary's throat by millimeters. "Got it!" Emily's triumphant cry rang out. The nightmare engine pulsed with new energy. A wave of psychic force radiated outward, shattering the psi shields of the Saurian elites. Zath staggered, momentarily stunned by the mental onslaught. Zachary seized the opening. He ducked under Zath's guard and drove his combat knife up into the soft flesh beneath her jaw. The warlord's eyes widened in shock and pain. She toppled backward, taking Zachary with her as they tumbled off the platform. They hit the ground hard, Zath's massive bulk crushing the air from Zachary's lungs. He rolled clear, gasping for breath, as the Saurian leader thrashed in her death throes. All around them, the alien forces fell into disarray without their leader. "Push them back," Colonel Hawkins roared, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. "For Earth!" The tide of battle turned. Human soldiers, bolstered by the nightmare engine's focused assault, drove the Saurians into full retreat. Warships fled Kepler 186F's atmosphere, leaving the planet's surface littered with the dead and dying of both species. As the last echoes of gunfire faded, Zachary staggered to his feet. The full weight of what had transpired settled over him like a shroud. How many had died? How many minds had been irreparably warped by the nightmare engine's influence? Major Prescott approached, his uniform torn and bloodied, but his bearing as rigid as ever. 2 military policemen flanked him. "Sergeant Zachary Thompson," Prescott intoned, "you are under arrest for unauthorized use of classified weaponry and the resultant deaths of Allied personnel." Zachary offered no resistance as the MPs cuffed him. As they led him away, he locked eyes with Lieutenant Chen. Her gaze held a mix of sorrow, understanding, and something else. A glimmer of hope, perhaps. Whatever came next, Zachary knew the true reckoning was yet to come. The cold steel of handcuffs bit into Zachary's wrists as he was led from the battlefield. The acrid smell of smoke and plasma discharge still hung in the air, mingling with the metallic tang of blood. He caught glimpses of his fellow soldiers, some regarding him with awe, others with fear or disgust. The weight of their gazes pressed down on him more heavily than any physical burden. Days blurred into weeks as Zachary languished in a military holding cell. His dreams were a kaleidoscope of horrors, echoes of the nightmare engine's influence. He'd jolt awake, drenched in sweat, the screams of both humans and Saurians ringing in his ears. The day of the tribunal arrived with a palpable tension. Zachary stood before a panel of stern-faced officers, the courtroom packed with media and spectators. Major Prescott's voice cut through the low murmur of the crowd. "Sergeant Zachary Thompson stands accused of gross insubordination, and the unauthorized use of a classified weapon, resulting in the deaths of Allied personnel. Prescott's words cracked like a whip. The Nightmare Engine is not a toy nor a simple gun. It is a weapon of mass psychological destruction. Colonel Hawkins, seated in the gallery, leaned forward with clenched fists, his eyes sharp as Prescott continued his opening statement. This man, Prescott pointed at Zachary, took it upon himself to unleash untold horrors upon friend and foe alike. The price of his actions cannot be measured in mere casualties, but in the very soul of humanity itself. As the trial progressed, a parade of witnesses took the stand. Some, like Private Rodriguez, spoke of Zachary's heroism. "We were overrun," Rodriguez testified, his voice shaking. "The Saurians were everywhere. If Sergeant Thompson hadn't used that weapon, none of us would be here today." Others painted a darker picture. Corporal Chen, her eyes hollow and unfocused, described the aftermath. "The nightmares won't stop," she whispered. "I see things, terrible things, and I can't tell what's real anymore." Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered. Some held signs proclaiming Zachary a hero, while others demanded justice for the lives lost. The schism within the military ranks reflected in the court of public opinion. Lieutenant Emily Chen approached the stand, her face etched with concern. She presented her findings on the Nightmare Engine's long-term effects. "Our data shows alarming rates of PTSD, paranoid delusions, and psychotic episodes among troops exposed to the weapon," she explained. "We're seeing breakdowns in unit cohesion, increased aggression, and in some cases, complete psychological collapse." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Zachary's stomach churned as he absorbed the implications of Chen's testimony. As the trial reached its fever pitch, an urgent message interrupted the proceedings. A young officer burst into the courtroom, face pale. "Sirs," he addressed the tribunal, "we've detected a massive Saurian fleet on approach to Earth. They've issued an ultimatum." The officer's voice quavered as he relayed the message. "Surrender the Nightmare Engine or face extinction." All eyes turned to Zachary. In that moment, the weight of humanity's fate pressed down upon his shoulders. Major Prescott and Colonel Hawkins locked gazes, their opposing viewpoints crystallized in this crucible of crisis. "We cannot use that infernal device again," Prescott insisted. "The cost is too high." Hawkins countered, his voice low and intense. "And if we don't, the cost will be everything." As the argument raged, Zachary stood silent, torn between the horror of what he'd done and the terrifying possibility that he might have to do it again. The Nightmare Engine loomed large in his mind, a Pandora's box of untold power and consequences. With the Saurian fleet bearing down on Earth, the true trial was only just beginning. The courtroom erupted into chaos as the young officer's words sank in. Zachary's ears rang with the cacophony of panicked voices and scraping chairs. Through the din, he locked eyes with Lieutenant Chen, her face a mask of unyielding commitment. Before anyone could react, a deafening screech filled the air. Every screen in the room flickered to life, revealing the scaled visage of Warlord Kalshara. Her mandibles clicked in barely suppressed rage as she delivered her ultimatum. "Humans," she hissed, "your pathetic resistance ends now. Surrender Zachary Thompson and the secrets of your mind weapon, or watch your homeworld burn." The feed cut out, plunging the room into stunned silence. Major Prescott was the first to recover, his face flushed with anger. "We cannot capitulate to terrorist demands," he shouted, smacking his head on the table. Colonel Hawkins rose to his feet, eyes blazing. "And we cannot stand idly by while Earth is reduced to ash." As the two officers faced off, Zachary felt a hand on his arm. He turned to see Chen, her eyes darting towards the exit. "Now's our chance," she whispered. In a blur of motion, Chen produced a plasma cutter from her sleeve. The restraints fell away from Zachary's wrists as alarms began to blare. A handful of soldiers loyal to Hawkins moved to block the door, buying them precious seconds. "This way," Chen shouted, leading Zachary and a small group through a maintenance hatch. They sprinted through narrow corridors, the sounds of pursuit growing fainter. Emerging into a hangar bay, they found a lone military shuttle waiting, engines already spooling up. How did you... Zachary began, but Chen cut him off with a grim smile. Let's just say I called in some favors. As they strapped in, the shuttle's view screen lit up with a tactical overlay. Zachary's breath caught in his throat at the sight of Kalshara's vanguard engaging the battered human fleet in orbit. "We're going to have to punch through that?" one of the soldiers asked, his voice wavering. Zachary gripped the controls, face hardened. "We don't have a choice." The shuttle rocketed skyward, weaving through a hail of plasma fire. Explosions bloomed in the void around them as human and saurian ships alike were torn apart. Through it all, Zachary kept his eyes fixed on their target, the last remaining Nightmare engine platform. As they approached the platform, a massive saurian dropship disgorged its cargo onto the planet's surface. Wave after wave of shock troops poured out, their scaled hides gleaming in the harsh sunlight. "They're going for the engine," Chen said, her fingers flying over the tactical display. "We need to reach it first." The shuttle touched down hard, rocking from the impact of nearby explosions. Zachary and his team spilled out, weapons at the ready. They found themselves in the midst of a war zone, human defenders barely holding the line against the saurian onslaught. As they fought their way towards the platform, Chen's calm crackled to life. Her eyes widened as she processed the incoming data. "Zachary," she called out over the din of battle, "the saurians! They've reverse-engineered the engine!" He ducked behind a barricade, narrowly avoiding a burst of plasma fire. "What are you talking about?" Chen's face was pale as she explained. "They're using it to amplify their warriors' bloodlust. It's making them unstoppable and immune to our version of the engine." Zachary's mind raced, weighing their options. He looked at Chen, saw the same realization dawning in her eyes. "We can't beat them at their own game," he said. Chen nodded grimly, "But we might be able to turn it against them." As Chen and her team sprinted for the Nightmare engine control room, Zachary gathered the remaining soldiers. "We're going after their Psi Nexus," he shouted over the roar of battle. "It's the only way to break their hold." They plunged into the fray, fighting tooth and nail towards the hulking saurian device. Plasma bolts sizzled past, the air thick with the stench of ozone and burning flesh. Zachary's world narrowed to a series of brutal, close-quarters engagements. A massive saurian warrior loomed before him, mandibles spread in a terrifying war cry. Zachary ducked under its swinging claws, driving his combat knife deep into the creature's abdomen. As it fell, he caught sight of the Psi Nexus, a pulsing orb of malevolent energy. "Now!" he roared, signaling his team. They opened fire, their combined firepower tearing into the device. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sound like reality itself tearing apart, the Nexus exploded in a blinding flash of psionic energy. Zachary was thrown back, his body battered by the shockwave. As he struggled to his feet, he saw the saurian forces in disarray, their psychic link shattered. In orbit, Kalshara's scream of rage echoed across all frequencies as her fleet tore itself apart, consumed by the very hatred and bloodlust she had sought to weaponize. Staggering towards the Nightmare engine platform, Zachary's body felt like one massive bruise. He could see the saurian ground forces regrouping, preparing for a final push. With a Herculean effort, he hauled himself into the control room. Chen looked up from the console, her face streaked with blood and grime. Their eyes met, a lifetime of understanding passing between them in that moment. "It's ready," she said softly. Zachary nodded, bracing himself against the wall as the platform began to shake. Outside, the saurian horde surged forward, mere moments from breaching their last defenses. As the Nightmare engine roared to life, its psychic tendrils reaching out to gather the sum total of human and alien suffering, Zachary closed his eyes. The galaxy held its breath, teetering on the edge of oblivion. Chen's finger hovered over the detonation trigger, a single tear tracing its way down her cheek. "For Earth," she whispered. And then she pressed the button.
You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.